The Reagan Way. Moral clarity about an evil adversary, and a strategy to hasten its collapse. Ronald Reagan famously won the Cold War without firing a shot. America's 40th president relentlessly applied economic, military, and moral pressure to the Soviet Empire, while at the same time taking care to avoid direct conflict with a nuclear-armed power. Speaking of moral pressure, it was 40 years ago this week that Reagan delivered one of the most consequential, and controversial, speeches of his presidency. It was especially controversial in diplomatic circles because Reagan decided to simply and plainly describe liberty's adversary. Addressing the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida on March 8, 1983, President Reagan, being Reagan, naturally started with some humor. An evangelical minister and a politician arrived at Heaven's Gate one day together. And St. Peter, after doing all the necessary formalities, took them in hand to show them where their quarters would be. And he took them to a small, single room with a bed, a chair, and a table and said this was for the clergyman. And the politician was a little worried about what might be in store for him. And he couldn't believe it then when St. Peter stopped in front of a beautiful mansion with lovely grounds, many servants, and told him that these would be his quarters. And he couldn't help but ask, he said, "But wait, how? There's something wrong. How do I get this mansion while that good and holy man only gets a single room?" And St. Peter said, "You have to understand how things are up here. We've got thousands and thousands of clergy. You're the first politician who ever made it." Then the president talked about the role of faith in the American founding, contemporary debates over morality in religion in public life, and parental rights, among other topics. Finally, he addressed the great struggle against communist tyranny. "There is sin and evil in the world," said Reagan, and acknowledged. "Our nation, too, has a legacy of evil with which it must deal. The glory of this land has been its capacity for transcending the moral evils of our past. For example, the long struggle of minority citizens for equal rights, once a source of disunity in civil war, is now a point of pride for all Americans. We must never go back. There is no room for racism, anti-Semitism, or other forms of ethnic and racial hatred in this country. I know that you've been horrified, as have I, by the resurgence of some hate groups preaching bigotry and prejudice. Use the mighty voice of your pulpits and the powerful standing of your churches to denounce and isolate these hate groups in our midst. The commandment given us is clear and simple: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But whatever sad episodes exist in our past, any objective observer must hold a positive view of American history, a history that has been the story of hopes fulfilled and dreams made into reality. Especially in this century, America has kept alight the torch of freedom, but not just for ourselves but for millions of others around the world. And this brings me to my final point today. During my first press conference as president, in answer to a direct question, I pointed out that, as good Marxist-Leninists, the Soviet leaders have openly and publicly declared that the only morality they recognize is that which will further their cause, which is world revolution. I think I should point out I was only quoting Lenin, their guiding spirit, who said in 1920 that they repudiate all morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas, that's their name for religion, or ideas that are outside class conceptions. Morality is entirely subordinate to the interests of class war. And everything is moral that is necessary for the annihilation of the old, exploiting social order and for uniting the proletariat. Well, I think the refusal of many influential people to accept this elementary fact of Soviet doctrine illustrates an historical reluctance to see totalitarian powers for what they are. We saw this phenomenon in the 1930s. We see it too often today. This doesn't mean we should isolate ourselves and refuse to seek an understanding with them. I intend to do everything I can to persuade them of our peaceful intent. At the same time, however, they must be made to understand we will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedom. Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. I believe we shall rise to the challenge. I believe that communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written. I believe this because the source of our strength in the quest for human freedom is not material, but spiritual. And because it knows no limitation, it must terrify and ultimately triumph over those who would enslave their fellow man. To many in the media the speech raised the specter of war. But Reagan knew that the best way to avoid one was to maintain a strong and resolute defense while seizing every opportunity to undermine and discredit and expose the monstrous Soviet regime, accelerating its inevitable collapse. The Reagan Way. Moral clarity about an evil adversary, and a strategy to hasten its collapse. Ronald Reagan famously won the Cold War without firing a shot. America's 40th president relentlessly applied economic, military and moral pressure to the Soviet Empire, while at the same time taking care to avoid direct conflict with a nuclear-armed power. Speaking of moral pressure, it was 40 years ago this week that